I wanted to welcome you all on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the School of Social Transformation and the Faculty of Justice and Social Inquiry to our third and final installment of Seeking Justice in Arizona. We are so pleased to have our speaker this afternoon. I'm looking out the view of our building here at the ASU Tempe campus, and I'm seeing some clouds come kind of thicken up and come closer, and that's a metaphor for how things are going in the reproductive health space. Clouds can be bring some relief to people. They can also bring some damage to people. So everyone has a stake in this conversation. To continue this weather metaphor, I know that we're all thinking about the people in Cuba who are surviving the onslaught of Hurricane Ian and the folks who are in Florida and on the pathway where the hurricane continues to go, who are not able to enjoy this kind of calm, air-conditioned space that we're in today as we're here together. Seeking Justice in Arizona was put together a number of years ago by faculty who wanted to provide all of us with an opportunity to meet people who are on the ground doing the work, forging various pathways to justice, knowing that there are so many different ways of defining what justice means and all sorts of tactics and strategies that we can develop together to pursue our visions of justice. I can't think of another person who would be more suitable for today's conversation than Dr. Deshawn Taylor, who is a medical doctor, a gynecologist, and a family planning specialist, a gender-affirming care provider, and a reproductive justice advocate who established Desert Star Family Planning Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. Also, she founded Desert Star Institute for Family Planning. It's a nonprofit organization for which she is the president, and that occurred in 2017. She's been recognized by the Maricopa County NAACP as a trailblazer, and most recently as a champion of choice by the National Institute for Reproductive Health. Dr. Taylor works to advance access to reproductive health care for people who can become pregnant through service provision, education and training, advocacy, and thought leadership. So first, we just want to welcome you, Dr. Taylor, to Arizona State University, to the School of Social Transformation. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you. I'm really excited about this discussion today. It's very timely.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about how timely it is in just a moment. I wish if you could help us understand how you got to where you are today. What motivates you personally, professionally? Perhaps there are other sources of motivation for the work that you do. Why are you working in this area?
Well, it's very fitting for me when I think back on my childhood and how I was the protector of the girls growing up. I'm the only girl with 3 brothers. And so I had this strong sense of being a protector. And that has stayed with me my entire life. Although I had a detour where I thought I'd be a brain surgeon. I'd convinced myself of that some time ago. But over time, I realized that, my heart really was with helping young girls and then women, and more specifically around empowering people to understand their bodies, make choices about their bodies. And so it was a very seamless transition once I made the choice that this was the right space for me to be in, and particularly grounding myself around reproductive health, specifically abortion and contraception, was a pathway that was surprising that I had to actually really intentionally concentrate myself into, because once I decided to be an obstetrician gynecologist, my initial thoughts were that if someone was pregnant and wanted to continue the pregnancy, then I would help them through that. And if someone was pregnant and didn't want to be, then I would help them through that. And when I started my specialization training and residency, I realized very quickly how polarizing abortion was, and honestly, even contraception. And so I decided really early in my career that with my strong sense of justice and social good, that this was going to be where my career was going to take me. I was going to really intentionally pursue a pathway related to complex family planning. And so I finished my residency, I did a fellowship, and then charted my path once I completed my training.
Thanks, Dr. Taylor. And as a reminder, we have students in our Introduction to Justice Studies class in attendance today, among other campus and community attendees. So just want to shout out to Dr. Holman for hosting us in her classroom, along with some other colleagues who are doing the same. One of the things that's interesting to me is that you helped to create this new agency, organization, and a nonprofit. Can you tell us a little more about the organization and what it's doing right now, and how they are distinguished from each other?
Yes, so I was born, raised, and trained in Los Angeles, California. And so family brought me to Arizona, actually. And I started off working with a statewide reproductive health organization. And as I have provided abortion care in different settings, I started to really start to bubble up in me this idea, this concept of how I would provide care if I was the one completely in charge of how it would go. And over the course of time, it became a really strong idea, to where I went against everything I had planned for myself, and never planning to start a private practice. But ultimately, the stars aligned, and it became very obvious that that's what I needed to do. And so Desert Star Family Planning was founded in 2013. We're actually celebrating 9 years of serving Arizona families this month. So that's also a really great coincidence in timing here. And so the goal was to integrate abortion care along with all the other care that was happening in the clinic. Because when we say that abortion is health care, then people should feel like they're at the doctor's office when they're receiving this care, just like any other care that they receive. So very intentional in combining services, creating an environment in the clinic where people feel safe and comfortable, and really paying attention to the details that let people know that we're really thinking about them, and their comfort and safety is really important to us. And so that formed the clinic, which provides general gynecology care, well woman care, all methods of reversible birth control, and abortion care, as well as miscarriage management, and recently adding on gender affirming care, hormone therapy for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. And so all of that was happening in the same space, not specifically one day for this, one day for that carve outs, but really an integration of services. And so it really created this really great community of people who were seeing us for their general gynecology, well woman care, knew that abortions were happening, and they were really happy about, being part of a practice where the doctor did that. And then there are people who received abortion care with us who then became general gynecology well woman patients. Then there are people who started to seek out the clinic because they really cared about the mission and they wanted to be under a provider who did that. And then especially once we started the gender affirming care, our general LGBTQ plus populations of patients began to grow as well, because then people are now, seeking out a provider who is holistically caring for a number of marginalized, stigmatized groups of people. And so then I started to think of myself as a health justice clinic. I intentionally formed the clinic and called it Desert Star Family Planning to be very clear in the type of care that we would provide as it related to reproductive health care, and in its evolution, in being able to listen to the community and be in community and be able to identify needs and then be able to address them. That's what's been really awesome about having a private practice, as opposed to working for a larger organization that has a bit more hoops to jump through, per se, to see a need in the community and then be able to meet it. The nonprofit then was born out of needs that were identified through working in the communities we served in the clinic. The clinic was intentionally located in a socioeconomically diverse and medically underserved community. And so there was a larger number of people of color, immigrants, asylum seekers, those type of people, and then starting to create relationships with community organizations who also were serving those same populations of people. We started to figure out that there were some important needs that needed to be met. And that's how the gender affirming service was brought about, in work in collaboration with Trans Queer Pueblo and some of the other grassroots organizations that I started to work with over the course of time. But the nonprofit initially was started because I also train future abortion providers. And so that's been a very important part of the work that I do. And so it started the nonprofit, allowed me to more formalize that process and curriculum for people and start to raise funds to offset the cost of that. And then from there, it built out to providing long-term birth control for uninsured people. And then from there, it grew out to, as I personally started to move from a reproductive health, then rights, then to a justice framework, then moving all of my work along that, seeing things and operating through a reproductive justice lens, then we are added in base building, development of community leadership and mobilization and those type of things that go along with justice movements. So that's how we've come full circle to where we are today, where the clinic is its entity, and then the nonprofit that's been in place for 5 years now is its entity. And then there's a group of work that each is doing that has me in common.
All in a day's work. It sounds like two of the key terms that resonate with your work is holistic and intersectional. And I know we're going to get a chance to hear more about that when you have some comments to bring to us with some slides. I also learned from your organization that today is International Safe Abortion Day. So another reason to convene together today. Are you ready for the slides from my end? Okay, great. So I'll do that thing that people do to share my screen, and I will go back to, there we go. And I will take direction from you in terms of advancing the slides. There we go.
Yes, so I am so glad to be able to bring this information to you all today. The timing is so important because we are in a moment right now that it requires all frameworks to address reproductive oppression. My next slide gives you an idea of kind of how our topic is going to progress. So you can go on to the next slide.
I will, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties that the slides are not being seen in the classroom. So I just wanted to do a quick check with our support people to see if this is because of who is being followed, the view perhaps on the webinar. So let's just take a quick pause. And in the meantime, students and others can be thinking about the kinds of questions that they want to pose to you moving forward.
Yeah, and so while we get the technology together here, basically this slide is just a bit of an outline to let folks know how the conversation is going, how the discussion is going to go forth today. So I'm going to start out with a bit of framing, And then we're going to go a bit more into the health, rights, and justice framework. And then I will discuss how reproductive justice definitely is a framework that helps to move us forward together. And I'll also spend a little bit of time on the actual laws and help to clarify some things for people, because I know there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation around the status of abortion care in the state. And so I can give you what I know is like the most recent information on what's going on there.
I'm going to go back and share the slides again, and also acknowledge that for all that slides are really, really helpful in the presentation, people can also keenly listen as needed, however awkward that might feel in the beginning, to people who are accustomed to be more visually stimulated, to make sure that we're able to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, and the way that I do this is every single thing that I say isn't necessarily going to be on a slide. And so what I like to do with slides is for people who are visual, be able to provide that, and then also kind of keep myself on track in terms of where I want to go with the discussion. So are we in a good place here? Have we identified that the slides are also visible to the folks in the classroom too?
I think we're still facing some issues, but we're going to carry forward.
And so you can go on with the next slide here. And so we're starting off from the understanding that as women and femmes of color, our rights to safe and voluntary sex, birth control, and motherhood has always been restricted, controlled, and criminalized. We have new laws and policies that make abortion access more difficult and costly. We have coercive contraceptive programs that have historically targeted low-income women and women of color. And these developments devalue our human rights and harm our ability to sustain our families, our communities, and our lives. And these attacks constitute unethical attempts to control our lives and dictate who among us can have, keep, and raise children. And so reproductive oppression refers to the regulation and exploitation of individuals' bodies, sexuality, labor, and procreative capacities as a strategy to control individuals and entire communities. And so while much of mainstream discussion and organizing about women's reproductive lives are centered on issues of choice and access to safe and legal abortion, Black women's reproductive lives are impacted by multiple social conditions that interfere in their right to not have children, but also their right to have children and raise them with dignity in a safe, healthy, and supportive environment. I attended the Black Maternal Health 2022 conference, and Loretta Ross was a keynote. And in her discussion, she stated that reproductive controls transcend the fertile body to include a range of policies. And consistently, over time, controlling the fertility of women has obsessed men since the Greek and Roman empires. And so when we think about this, we think of how some of these policies lead to health neglect and mass incarceration of Black women because of the over-policing of our communities. Today, Black women make up only 13% of women in the country, but represent 30% of the women's prison population and 44% of women in jail. And this incarceration of Black women exacerbates structural conditions that families are already experiencing, right? These police murders of Black children, and it denies Black women the right to raise their children in healthy and supportive environments. Black women caretakers are in constant state of worry, subject to emotional turmoils that come from the fear that their children may not come home, and the pain of mourning the children who are taken away from them. And this regard plays out in Black mothers becoming targets of violence while protecting and fighting for the lives of their children. And that, unfortunately, it consistently has been shown over and over again that the legal system routinely fails Black girls, women, and non-binary survivors of violence. And this disproportionately is experienced at home, at school, on the job, and in their neighborhoods. We also have the history of involuntary, non-consensual, and coerced sterilization in the United States. And that continues to have profound impacts on the lives of Black women. Next slide. Throughout the 20th century, eugenic ideologies that position non-whites, people with disabilities, and poor people as intellectually and morally inferior aligned with controlling images that position Black women as promiscuous, i.e. the Jezebel, and Black mothers as lazy, i.e. the welfare queen. These provided the social and scientific rationale that legitimized medical practices, policies, and laws aimed at controlling the population growth in Black communities. Eugenic state laws that legitimized the involuntary sterilization of people with disabilities and institutionalized individuals disproportionately impacted young and poor Black women, often diagnosed as mentally ill because they were seen as promiscuous, had children outside of marriage, or were engaged in interracial sex. And so, because reproductive oppression affects women, girls, and femmes in multiple ways, a multiple approach is needed to fight this exploitation and advance our well-being. Next slide. So this is where we introduce the 3 frameworks to address reproductive oppression. So we have reproductive health, which focuses on the provision of services to individuals. We have reproductive rights, where the goal is to protect the legal right to reproductive health care services, particularly abortion. And then we have reproductive justice that attends to movement building and intersectionality, how systems of oppression intersect to create unique issues for people situated at multiple margins. And although distinct frameworks in relation to their approaches, together they provide a comprehensive solution. Ultimately, as in any movement, all 3 components, service, advocacy, and organizing, are crucial. Next slide. So with the reproductive health framework, particular attention is paid to expanding access to preventive care and culturally competent services. However, the dominant conceptual framework for understanding reproductive behavior is highly individualistic and therefore limited by the individualization of the delivery of services. And such conceptualization is flawed because behavior is shaped by social relations and institutions. So reproductive health does not address the root causes of social inequality because it does not take into account the structural inequalities among people of varying cultures and backgrounds that account for different levels of access to education and services. And so what this slide shows is a little bit of context around social vulnerability. And this is an important context to bring to reproductive health. And so I came across this very interesting paper that provides a lot more detail than what I'm going to provide today. And I do want to drop that link into the chat. I'm going to do that really quick before I go ahead here. So I'm able to put this in host and panelist, and then I believe that Madeline will be able to get this out more broadly.
We will, thank you.
Okay. And so The social context of reproductive health needs to be understood from the perspective of the poorest and the most marginalized and socially excluded. This concept of vulnerability moves beyond notions of individual risk behavior to a consideration of the context in which people are placed at risk of poor reproductive health outcomes. While vulnerability is linked to poverty, poor reproductive health may not be the effect of poverty alone, but to processes and forms of power which lead to social exclusion. And an underlying determinant of social vulnerability is the extent to which people are able to realize their rights to protection from risk and to access services and resources. And what we've seen is inattention to context is evident in many reproductive health interventions and policies. And so the first thing here is poverty, livelihood strategies, and social capital. So what are we thinking about with that? What are household access to economic resources? What differences are there in levels of household access to economic resources in decision-making, and how that impacts different household members by gender, age, and how do they interact with food, the healthcare system, what are people's preferences, how important is it to maintain good health? Social capital is closely linked to livelihood strategies and refers to both social resources such as kin groups, community organizations, peer networks, and symbolic assets such as ancestral lineages, spiritual resources, church affiliation, and where different groups are drawing from as their means of social security. So what sources of social capital do people draw on? And how do sources of social capital impact health, sexuality, and fertility? And then a next part here, and there are more of these that the authors discussed, but for the purposes of time and for this presentation, I pulled out some that I found most intriguing. So the next one is sexuality, sexual health, sexual behavior, and sexual health. So how are sexuality and sexual behavior understood and experienced locally? So key issues might include the diversity of sexual behavior among different groups of primary stakeholders, sources of knowledge on sexuality and sexual health, like what are the traditional mechanisms of sex education? Are people getting this information through kinship relationships? What's the impact of urban modernization and media to this behavior? How different sexual identities and relationships are constructed and experienced? Like, for example, commercial sex, same-sex relationships, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, marital and extramarital relationships. And so there's context there in how people are experiencing sexual sex, their sexuality, and their behaviors, right? And then we have local knowledge, health-seeking behavior, and access to quality services. And so reproductive health programming requires an awareness of local systems of knowledge and health practice. Cultural context is central to the response to health and illness, with knowledge relating to health and ill health shaped by culturally specific practices. And these vary between different social groups and networks. Consequently, the meanings attributed to health-related behavior by health professionals are often very different to those of lay people, specifically when there are discordance in race and ethnicity and cultural experiences between most providers and their patients, right? And so the social experience of health and illness contributes to the construction of local knowledge that informs health-seeking behavior. Access is the social interface between services and the community. Assessing access requires determining the extent to which services may be obtained at a level of effort and of monetary opportunity and social costs that are acceptable and within the means of poor, marginalized, and vulnerable people. And then quality is a social experience. It is how people are experiencing services and how that relates to the extent to whether the program is responding to the perceived needs and demands of the clients and potential clients. And oftentimes assumptions of the clients and potential clients about the quality often differ from those of providers, managers, and policymakers, as we're all aware. And so and in thinking about reproductive health, and oftentimes when I do a discussion, I often introduce the frameworks and then go right into a discussion on reproductive justice. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to build out this reproductive health framework a little bit more, especially in the context of this talk and the types of people who may be potentially attending and participating in this, so that we can start to really think about how to move reproductive health programming from an individual frame to a more holistic frame about how people are interacting not only with the healthcare system, but with their knowledge and understanding of their health and sexuality. Next slide. Another important aspect of the reproductive health discourse are social determinants of health. These also contribute to the conditions of non-equitable outcomes related to the health of vulnerable populations. And so we have the lack of access to safe and affordable housing, nutritious food, adequate and reliable transportation. And then we also have the close proximity to hazardous environmental toxins. And so these are very important things to look at when we are trying to determine why we have poor reproductive health outcomes in terms of maternal mortality or infant mortality, when we have these underlying conditions in people's communities that are putting them at greater risk of being unhealthy in general. And so then we have pregnancy and childbirth that happens on top of that. And then we see why Black maternal death rate is 3 to 4 times that of white women, independent of socioeconomic class or education, and how Black infants have higher death rates as well. Next slide. And so now I want to talk a bit more about the reproductive rights, and I also put choice because that's really the framework that reproductive rights has been discussed through. And so we codified this with the 1973 Supreme Court Roe v. Wade decision, given the right to abortion care due to the right to privacy. And we've been in a defensive posture ever since this decision. Within the United States, the reproductive rights advocacy community organizes people to participate in legislative and electoral processes on the state and federal level, which targets policymakers, legal experts, and elected officials. And so the legal basis for reproductive rights emerges from a protection of the privacy of women, which does not attest to the role of the government in eliminating social inequalities which impact health disparities. And that quote unquote choices that people who can become pregnant can make, right? So we see this with the introduction of the Hyde Amendment in 1976, which blocked federal Medicaid funding for abortion services. Since 1994, there have been 3 extremely narrow exceptions, which include continuing the pregnancy, being able to fund an abortion through Medicaid, for example, if the pregnancy would endanger the person's life, or when the pregnancy results from rape or incest. And the thing is, in order for federal funds to pay for these things, there has to be a level of scrutiny and a paper trail to a certain extent. And so you essentially are victimizing people during some of the most troubling times of their life. Marginalized communities in the United States, such as immigrants, people of color, poor people, young people, and disabled people, often lack the faith, knowledge, or resources to request the political system to meet their needs. The reproductive rights discourse focuses on the rights of an individual, often to the exclusion of the wider social and economic conditions within which rights are defined and realized. And so such a perspective underplays the extent to which poor and vulnerable people are not able to recognize their rights or realize their rights to the economic and social resources vital for the protection of their health and well-being. And so as a mainstream movement in the 1970s that brought Roe, this was really focused on the concerns of white, middle-class, cisgender women. It was framed as pro-choice because this type of woman generally was thought to have a choice. She could stay home with her children or not. She could access abortion care or not. And so Roe v. Wade gave the very minimal right to abortion care, but it did not actually provide meaningful access to abortion for everyone. Even though 7 in 10 people in America support abortion rights, and 1 in 4 American women of reproductive age will have an abortion by the age of 45, over 1,381 restrictions later, Arizona has become the 13th state to ban abortion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Continuing with the reproductive rights framework, what it also allowed was these targeted regulation of abortion care providers. These are strict regulations imposed only on abortion clinics beyond what is necessary to ensure patient safety. And so with these laws, there was a steady chipping away at our ability to serve the communities that need us and essentially regulating many abortion care providers out of existence. Abortion bans turn pregnant people, their physicians, birth workers, and now even friends and families into criminals. We know that marginalized people are already criminalized for unjust reasons. And in addition, so-called justice is not handed out equally among all people. There's no reason to expect any of this to be different as ever more stringent abortion laws are enforced. And this will also impact all types of pregnancy outcomes, not only people who seek abortion care. And in an amicus brief that was presented to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, which was at the center of the Supreme Court case where the decision overturned Roe v. Wade, concerned attorneys, researchers, and others pointed out that criminalization of reproductive outcomes has devastating, even life-threatening consequences. It prevents people from seeking medical care when they need it, subjects them to cruel and humiliating investigations in the midst of medical emergencies, and consigns them to stigma and condemnation in their communities. Worse, the harms of criminalization are disproportionately borne by people who are already marginalized due to racism, sexism, and socioeconomic disadvantage. So what I'm finding is people often don't realize that every law passed to curtail abortion access creates opportunities to criminalize providers and pregnant people. And as the main institutional contact with pregnant people, our job as medical and medical adjacent providers is to welcome, protect, and help people, not surveil and potentially criminalize them. Next slide. So, status of abortion access in Arizona. On Friday, September 23rd, a judge in Pima County, where this case was being heard, allowed an 1864 pre-statehood abortion ban to go into effect. And what does pre-statehood mean? This is 1864 Civil War era. Arizona was a territory when this law was written. And this law bans nearly all abortion care in Arizona. So when I say nearly all, what I mean is that there is a provision to provide abortion care to someone whose life is at risk, and immediate risk. So the litigants of the case from which this decision was came down was Planned Parenthood Arizona, and Attorney General Mark Brnovich. An appeal has been filed along with a motion to provide a stay of enforcement of the ban while this case goes forward. And so I know that there's a lot of confusion about, you know, is abortion totally banned in Arizona? I thought the governor signed a 15-week ban. So I'm going to give you a bit more context for this. This initial law in 1864, this ban stayed on the books. It was reaffirmed in 1901 and again in the 1970s. In 1972, advocates litigated to try to make abortion legal in Arizona. And the advocates did not prevail. At that time, it was ruled that the Arizona Constitution did not provide for access to abortion. And so then the enforcement of the law was suspended in 1973 with the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling. Unfortunately, this law was not repealed, despite attempts in recent years to do so. So when opponents of abortion, so anti-abortion people wrote Arizona's Senate Bill 1164, which is the 15-week abortion ban that you may have heard about, this is a very similar bill to the one that was at the heart of the Dobbs v. Jackson case. When they wrote this, they wanted this territorial ban to take effect, but were willing to settle for the 15-week limit if Roe v. Wade was not overturned. How do we know this? Next slide. Governor Ducey signed this law March 30th, knowing it contained the language that would reinstate Arizona's pre-statehood ban if Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so this reads, this act does not, 1, create or recognize a right to abortion or alter generally accepted medical standards. The legislature does not intend this act to make lawful an abortion that is currently unlawful. This act does not, 2, repeal by implication or otherwise Section 133603 Arizona Revised Statutes or any other applicable state law regulating or restricting abortion. And so the pre-statehood ban that is currently in effect right now is ARS 13-3603. So I hope this helps with any confusion that people were experiencing around what's going on right now. The Supreme Court issuing the ruling on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization opened the door for the Attorney General to argue that the full ban take effect. And that is exactly what the Pima County judge ruled on September 23rd. So for me, it's clear, and it's been clear, that banning abortion altogether was the goal when Arizona's legislature passed the bill setting a 15-week limit this year, and they achieved it. And the only way to fix this is to change who runs the state. Next slide. So our third framework to address here is reproductive justice. And reproductive justice is the right to bodily autonomy, the right to bear children, the right to not bear children, and the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. And the achievement of reproductive justice requires a paradigm shift in consciousness for many people and a radical transformation of society. As a long-term change strategy, reproductive justice requires resources and sustained organizing and momentum. This framework was initially created by the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, a group that evolved into the well-known organization Sister Song. This group emerged in 1994 to surge a national movement that prioritized the needs of marginalized women and their families and communities. This framework analyzes how the conditions of how our reproductive destiny is linked directly to the conditions of our community. And these conditions are not just a matter of individual choice and access. Reproductive justice addresses the social reality of inequality, specifically the inequality of our opportunities to control our reproductive destiny. So in this framework, we're moving beyond a demand for privacy and respect for individual decision-making to include the social support necessary for our individual decisions to be optimized. So this framework also includes the obligations of our government to provide the conditions for our choices to be safe, affordable, and accessible. Right? These are three minimal cornerstones of government support for all individual life decisions. And so in order to address the needs and issues of a diverse group of people while acknowledging the layers of oppressions that our communities face, we must continue to build a movement for reproductive justice. You know, we particularly need to be centering people who do not have access to privilege, power, and resources. We must do this by integrating the needs of our grassroots communities into policy and advocacy efforts, and create opportunities for new leaders to emerge within our communities to increase the capacity, effectiveness, and scope of the movement. And this has been the work I've been cultivating for the past few years here in Arizona. In local, state, and national contexts, we must address the distribution of resources, right? Inequitable distribution of power within our movement. And we want to work to hold our allies and ourselves responsible for constructing principled collaborative relationships that end the exploitation and competition within our movement. With the reproductive justice framework, we understand that reproductive health issues cannot be separated from the interlocking systems of oppression that women, girls, and femmes face globally. And I do want to take a moment to show solidarity with the women of Iran who are risking their lives in protests right now. We are all interconnected. And so I do want to leave time for us to have some Q&A. The next slide, go ahead and advance that, is a slide of suggested books to assist you with your reproductive justice reading. I also want to provide this link here to a website that has a lot of great resources that includes documents and essays, as well as the books that I've mentioned here on the slide. So I'm going to drop that. This is from the Reproductive Justice Collective New York. This is a great list that has links as well. But in terms of the books, we have, I sampled from the Reproductive Justice Framework, Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center by Bell Hooks. In terms of abolition or criminalization, we have Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty by Dorothy Roberts. And from a social reproduction theory side of things, we have The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan. I probably murdered that. And so that information that link will be provided to you as well. And next slide. So some specific calls to action that I want to share with you all. It's really important that the needs of Black women and Black people who can become pregnant are centered in policies and programs. Because when we do that, by default, we are going to improve the conditions of everybody. Another call to action is educate your friends, family, and peers about the importance of access to safe, affordable abortion care. Gather with your friends and colleagues to read and learn more about reproductive justice. And so I provided you some books here, and then there'll be a link to follow that will send you along the right path related to that. And I know that there's a lot of discussion, especially in marginalized communities, about voting, and people vote and they don't see their conditions change, and So why vote? This is such a momentous time in our lives that I really hope that people are inspired and encouraged to exercise your right to vote. Midterm elections are notoriously not, people don't show up. And I'll give you an example. Governor Ducey barely won on a 19% voter turnout that first election where he was elected. And so these people who are not representing the will of the majority of Arizonans stay in their positions because oftentimes these elections happen in the middle, not with the larger presidential elections where people are used to showing up. So please do that, because the only way that our conditions change where we can get to a place where we're expanding access to healthcare instead of chipping away at it and taking it away completely is to change who runs the state. Please volunteer for a campaign, help get out the vote, canvass, phone bank, etc. There are many organizations available to you to do so. Specifically, I want to shout out Black Political Cultivation Arizona as a newly formed organization that centers educating and raising the voices and power of Black Arizonans in the political process. And of course, you have your NARALs and your Planned Parenthoods and other organizations that people are used to getting information from. Next slide. And I wanted to share that this is only the second time that I've publicly mentioned that I have authored a book. It's called Undue Burden, a Black woman physician on being Christian and pro-abortion and the reproductive justice movement. This book is supposed to be launched the beginning of 2023. And so I'm providing a link where people who are interested in following when this book will be launched and how you can purchase it, you can fill in your name and email address, and we can have you on the list so you can be in the loop with that. And next slide. We are ready to chat. So thank you very much for the opportunity to give you guys some of this good information here, and I look forward to taking questions.
Thank you so much. I want to say that we are clapping for you, and we have students and people on and off campus who are attending here. And I'm doing a quick check into the Q&A, and I've also have a couple questions. People should know that the talk is being recorded and will be posted on the School of Social Transformation's website. Check under events. You could Google Seeking Justice in Arizona to find that as well. I know that there's a question ready to go from Professor Holman. So let's see if our technology will let us hear that question.
All right, Maddie, can you hear me? Dr. Adelman? Can you hear us? Excellent. Dr. Taylor, thanks so much. First of all, let me just take 2 seconds to say thank you for your time and contributions today. This is really fascinating and really helpful. So personally, I just want to thank you. And then I'm going to, hopefully our mics will work. If not, I will relay the question for you. So Alyssa. Can you hear Alyssa? Can you talk? Okay. No. 1 second, I'll relay it. The 2-part or 1-part? Okay, super. Okay, 1-part question. Dr. Taylor, do you think that the question is, do you think that there should be more options or alternatives for male contraception?
Yes. What's been interesting, there have been ongoing studies for male birth control. And what's so interesting is that the side effects just aren't tolerable. And that's really funny, right? Because I mean, women and people who can still become pregnant deal with side effects of birth control all the time. And so that's definitely a definite sign of how patriarchy works, right? Women and people with reproductive organs who can become pregnant should be able to bear the burden and the risk and side effects, but it's not acceptable for males to do that. There have been some really promising things, like one of the things that's difficult about male birth control is that, you know, the sperm continue to be created, millions of them. And that happens through a very long course of time. Whereas with females, we're born with a certain number of functional eggs and they decrease over time. And so there becomes a time when, you know, a woman or someone who has female organs, ability to become pregnant goes away. And so that's another challenge to male contraception that needs to be overcome. But the main holdup to these studies that I've noticed is that just participants can't, they can't deal well with the side effects.
All right. Thank you. Actually, Dr. Taylor, we have a couple more questions.
Great.
Yeah. So try to talk loud. Let's try.
Do you guys hear me?
Barely.
Oh, okay. So my question is, what can we do to basically gain more like political support for this issue, especially since there is like an increasing right-wing movement, and basically there's other issues that I would say like the right side are more focused on. So how do we get those that are in support of pro-choice but are against other left-wing movements to like be persuaded to basically vote for this issue?
This is, I heard the question.
Super, thank you.
Yeah, so, you know, this is why one of the reasons that I really feel like a justice framework is helpful, because it really requires an intersectional approach, meaning that you're finding where the commonalities in the margins of things. So for example, you have people who believe in defunding the police. So they're, you know, these abolitionists defund the police. Well, they've not been particularly paying attention to the reproductive rights movement, but, you know, abortion bans criminalize pregnant people and the people, potentially the people who care for them from a medical standpoint and in their lives. And so if we say that someone wants to defund the police, abolish prisons, but then you have no interest in a whole set of laws that criminalize women and people who can experience pregnancy and potentially put people in jail for miscarriages, you know, we have to be able to find an alignment there, right? And so, you know, those are the things that, the places where I think that we can make a bit more effort, you know, to reach across. Like I'm pretty frustrated with this idea that we would reach across to someone who doesn't value a pregnant person's life and particularly sees them as the incubator of the next generation of people who are going to populate the earth. And so therefore her humanity or their humanity no longer exists once they become pregnant. Like those aren't the people I'm trying to reach across to have a conversation with. But there are people who are fighting battles that intersect with each other, and to find the ways to bring those people along, to amplify each other's work is where I think some of the solutions lie.
Thank you so much. Next question from Madeline. She's going to stand up and see if we can help that mic.
Can you hear me?
Maybe a little bit louder. I can hear a little bit.
So regarding the 1864 abortion ban that you said like had gone into effect, do you think that will impact women's access to contraception like the pill and IUDs in Arizona?
So that law, the question was around, do we think that with the laws that are going into effect now, would that impact people's ability to access contraception? Was that the question?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay. So now the thing is that there was a suite of these pre-territorial laws that also specifically criminalized the use of contraception. There was an era called Comstock, where a bunch of these different laws were created related to obscenity and lewdness and those type of things. So contraceptive laws kind of fell into that group of laws, anti-contraceptive laws and anti-abortion laws. And so, we have laws on the books that criminalize potentially advertising for contraceptives. Now, what's just happened over time is even though these laws have not been repealed, they've just not been enforced. And so, there's a question about, under this current law, could it be illegal for people to get birth control? Now, I would say that probably not, to the extent that this energy is really around banning abortion, specifically in this moment, but not to say that, someone could pick up that mantle and decide that they want to specifically legislate around that. Is not, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happening across the country. And so, but in this moment in time, that I don't think that people should be concerned about trying to make sure they have birth control right now.
I wanted to piggyback on that question, actually, because we had another Q&A, another Q that wants an A submitted. And that is not just about access to contraception, but some people are interested in, to what extent does the 1864 based statute 133603 prevent access to medical abortion? I think a lot of people have in their minds surgical abortions as the thing that's being prevented or banned based on the 1864 related statute. But can you help people understand access to medical abortion, or what the difference is?
It's all abortion. So the thing is, anything that a person could procure to end a pregnancy, to cause a miscarriage, is an abortion. So that's by surgical means, that's by FDA approved medications, that's by herbs, that's by whatever, someone would attempt to use. I will say though that there was a law, SB Senate Bill 1457, that was signed in 2021 that repealed the criminalization of the abortion seeker from this old law. So there isn't any criminal penalty for someone procuring themselves an abortion. The penalty remains for the person who would assist the individual in obtaining the abortion. So that is the difference here. But so by any means, so for me, as an established abortion provider, as someone who's on record with the state, as someone who runs an abortion clinic, who is already surveilled by the state, there is no way that I personally could go out and feel safe helping someone outside of my clinic as an individual citizen to have an abortion. But as we know, even when abortion is illegal, people still have them and do them and figure it out. And so the criminalization aspect of this is particularly around the actual likely physicians, whoever's the licensed person who would help someone seek an abortion. And what's problematic about this is that there is a whole movement that enlists people to go attempt to do gotchas. So people will pose as an abortion seeker to test whether known quote unquote abortionists are providing illegal abortions. And so that's what's also contributes to the depravity of this situation that we're in.
You know, I wanted to add yet another layer here, because I think this is a question that students posed to me earlier today. What about the people who provide information or money or a ride or a place to stay for women and others who are seeking abortions in this state of Arizona to go out of the state of Arizona?
And so, you know, that requires a bit more legal analysis, but up until this point, we had gotten to a place where, because of the intent of the law is to criminalize providers, then it's less likely that a prosecutor would take a case against someone who's financing an abortion or driving someone or otherwise providing other types of support. I think what helped in this situation was the stay of enforcement of the fetal personhood law. The fetal personhood law was part of a suite of things that was thrown into Senate Bill 1457 that was signed into law in 2021 by the governor. One of the provisions, the provision that I think people heard the most about, was the ban on abortions for known fetal genetic abnormalities. That part of the law was enjoined, which means it was not able to be enforceable. But this fetal personhood part did not receive an injunction because a judge was like, well, how is somebody going to use this? So we pretty much had to just kind of that's been the law of the land for some time, like for a year. And so once the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, we brought that question back. And then a judge did stay enforcement of that law, because without Roe v. Wade, you know, then you open up a lot of people to the potential of being sued on behalf of the fetus, embryo, et cetera, right? And so with that off the table, then, you know, we felt a lot more comfortable with the idea that the average person who's assisting someone who is seeking abortion care would probably not have, you know, a case that could, you know, be brought against them. Now, having said that, I can understand, though, that, you know, people are concerned, because ultimately, whether or not a case ultimately is brought against them, if someone, you know, was jailed or, you know, spent the night in jail or whatever happened, you know, before it would even get to the point where a prosecutor would say, I'm not going to take that case, you know, lives can already be ruined. And so I think that those are valid concerns that people have. What I recommend is that if people are wanting to be helpful, to align themselves with organizations that are already doing the work, because those organizations have, you know, have access to legal counsel, and they have figured out a safe way to go about helping people get care. And so I think that would be the best way to do this, as opposed to kind of going out on your own and deciding that you want to be helpful.
Thanks so much. And the way you're answering this, it sounds as if you've also earned a law degree along with your medical degree. And a lot of our students are interested in going to law school, and it sounds like there's some room there for people to learn at least how the law works, how complex it is, the local, the state, the federal kinds of laws and their regulation. Another piece of the law, medical, like political economy nexus, another question has been posed. One of our attendees is interested to know, do you think that with the increased surveillance, regulation, and ultimate banning of abortions, that contraceptives such as IUDs will actually become more accessible or affordable? So it's a kind of interesting flip of the question. What do you foresee, or what do you recommend for people who are interested in those kinds of services becoming more affordable or accessible?
The unfortunate answer to this is absolutely not, because ultimately it's not about abortion specifically, but it's about taking us back to a time where women particularly did not have any type of control over their fertility at all. So we already have legislatures across the country who have started to introduce bills to start to curb people's access to contraceptives. So it's not propaganda when we say it was never really about abortion, but about control. And you know, Loretta Ross, during her talk at the conference, it really hit home when she said the control of women's fertility is of major importance to people in power, because we need bodies. And so to the extent that you have any, you know, movement, any white supremacist movement, I mean, even honestly, during the time of Black nationalism, it was like, we need to have more babies to further the cause of whatever group is trying to maintain or gain or sustain power, right? And so the control of the fertility of people who have uteruses for the cause is something that's happened over the course of time. So it's really not about increasing access to contraceptives so people don't have abortion. The whole point is that people become pregnant and have more babies.
Dr. Taylor, as we wrap things up, we like to ask this question of all of our speakers. It's really hard to do this work. It's getting harder. And I know that you work in a community and in coalition, but can you help us think through what hope means to you and how you sustain yourself and your organization and your community as you're working on this pathway towards justice?
Well, hope is a very important piece of this. I think that although I'm a realist, I don't consider myself cynical. I don't, there are times where things seem like we just aren't making enough progress. We make progress and we take steps back. But one thing that we know over time is that as a society, we see the side of justice, but it does require a great deal of persistence and collaboration. And when we get to this place where we're into this rugged individualism and my this and that, then, you know, those are the moments in time where we actually take steps backwards, right? So when we have these really strong, collaborative, consistent social justice movements that bring in all types of different types of people, that's when our successes are made, right? And then when people fall back and they go, okay, I've got mine, right? And then you watch the next group come up and struggle and, you know, I got mine, right? And so, you know, continuing to find who your people are and build with them is it helps to sustain you in the work. And also you have to have hope to even continue to do work in the face of challenges, right? And so, you know, I do believe that, you know, the arc of justice bends, you know, to the right place. And we do come out on the other side of challenges. But sometimes it can be a long game. And we have to find ways that we support each other. A couple of years ago, someone said something to me that really resonated. People are like, self-care, self-care, you gotta take care of yourself. And I'm like, I give massages, I can meditate, but what I need is help. Like, and so somebody's like, yeah, Dr. Taylor needs community care. I'm like, yes, I need community care. You know, because it's especially for an independent provider like myself, where we don't have these large systems of volunteers and things that like an entity like Planned Parenthood has, for example. It can be very difficult when you feel like, you know, you can't break or you can't fall short because ultimately the work doesn't get done. And so I mentioned early on when all of this was happening after Roe v. Wade was overturned, it's like, I don't need to be called a hero. I need help. I'm not looking to be a martyr for the cause. I just want to be part of one of the cogs in the wheel that keeps this thing turning, and helping to educate and empower and eventually pass the baton to the next generation of people who will continue to do the work.
Well, I think you're doing just that. You are pushing us forward and passing the baton by meeting and joining with us today, where multiple generations are gathering to listen to your experience, your insight, and your clarifications of what the status of the law is today, which I think has been very confusing for lots of people. So we want to say thank you, and wish you the best as you keep moving on in community, in the work that you're doing. I want to say thank you to Professor Hellman. We also want to thank Mike DeSanti and all the staff that have made this possible, working through the technology. And Dr. Taylor, kudos for being willing to be part of our Seeking Justice in Arizona series for 2022. And we'll look forward to seeing our attendees next fall when we bring more voices in to give us additional insight into the future of the state of Arizona. And we thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.